Hello to all of you, the integrators that want to dive into the Tapkey Web API and are keen to try it out practically by coding. I assume most of you have seen our part 1 of the Getting Started webinar, where I introduced all the fundamentals and showed you a short demo of how to start. For those of you who missed it, you can find the recording on Tapkey YouTube channel, and the link is also pasted in the description of this video. How to series should show you a practical coding example, basically line by line, and should emphasize how actually easy using of Tapkey Web API is. My name is Eduard Krak, I'm a software developer at Tapkey, and today I will create a .NET C# application using client credentials flow that will list all of my owners, bound logs, and give a time-restricted access grants for the users that I define. I will use Visual Studio 2022 and create a console application using .NET 6. Let's move right away to the start with creating of the new project. I have opened a new instance of Visual Studio 2022 and I want to create a new project. I see that the filters are set right, C#, console, so I select a console app, click next, and I can define the name. Let's call it How to Web API Client Credentials. I'll click next. I select .NET 6. And I will create a new project. The project is initialized and we can start the implementation. As you know, with client credentials, we will need to pass the client ID and client secret to the application, and to do so, we will use the command line arguments. To parse the command line arguments, I will use the third-party library. In this case, command line parser. Choice of the third-party library or not to use the third-party library is totally up to you. This is what I have decided for right now. Now when I have the library installed and I already know the library, I know that the first step is to create an options class. So let's do so. Remove unnecessary references. Let's make this public. And we need to define two arguments that we expect. So one is the client ID and the second is the client secret. We need to define them to be options that can be either defined by Y or longer by client ID. They'll be required. And we can also define the help text, which will be client ID of your OAuth client. We define the same for client secret, which will be defined by S, client secret, and it's a client secret of your OAuth client. Now, when we have this defined, we can use it in our program CS. So let's remove this code and create the options. We code like this. Options. Get command line arguments. Yeah, this is something that is really specific to this library. And we can also check that the options were parsed correctly. So in case they were not, we can return the argument exception, unexpected input parameters. Let's move to our documentation page, developers.tapkey.io, open web APIs, authentication, and the client credentials, what we are going to implement today. Let's have a look on the details. So if we want to receive a token, we need to send a post request to login.tapkey.com, connect token. with form URL encoded parameters with client ID, client secret, scope, and grant type. And in return, we get access token that we can use for our API calls. So let's start with creation of the authentication class that will handle all of this for us. So I'll create an authentication. Of course, in ideal case and in your production case, you should use a library, or OAuth2 compliant library that can handle all of this. I just want to show you how simple it actually is, but it will not cover any edge cases. The error handling won't be proper, but I just want to show you how it works. So let's make this class public and let's create one static method with retrieve access token, and for that we'll need the client ID and client secret. So at first we create an HTTP client, and for a request we will need to send parameters as we have just read. So let's create a new dictionary of string which will contain parameters client ID, that's what we get in the arguments, client secret, then scope, we will define that later, and the grant type. We have read in the documentation that this needs to be always client credentials if we use client credentials type. Okay, now when we have this, we will make a post call. So let's call our client with post async on https login.tapkey.com/connect/token with form URL encoded parameters, and once we have the response, we will read the content. We can check if the response was actually successful. If it hasn't been, then we throw, for example, invalid operation exception with problem while requesting token. Should put it inside. Okay. To actually read the data that have been returned in this call, we will need to create a new class, the token response. So that's what we also seen in the documentation. So the token response will have three properties. One for access token, one for expires in, which will be integer, and one for token type. Okay, and when we have this, we can actually parse our response in the authentication method. So let's return JSON serializer dot deserialize token response, from the string, and we also need to make this return value. Okay, so this way we should actually be able to retrieve the access token from the command line arguments. So let's do so. Let's get the token response from authentication, retrieve access token, and take the client ID and client secret from the options. Now when we have the access token, we can actually start using it with Tapkey Web API. So let's create a class for it, which will be called Tapkey API. Let's make it public. It will hold an HTTP client, which will be initialized in the constructor. To the constructor, we will also pass the access token that we have just received and set it as a default header of this client. And we can also define the base address of this client, which will be, in our case, https my.tapkey.com. Okay. Now the methods. This application will receive all of the owner accounts, all of the bound logs for these owner accounts, and create grants for the users you will define. For all of these calls, we'll actually need to create some models, some objects we are going to be working with. So let's have a look on the documentation. In the operations section, we see we can download the JSON files, the Swagger JSON file, that you can use to generate these objects automatically. I'll create them manually. I don't need all properties of all the objects. I don't need all the objects, so I'll just do it manually in this case. So as a first call is the owners. So we see it's on /API/version1/owners. We need a scope, read owner accounts, and we'll receive the owner accounts with the ID and name. So let's go back to the code, create a folder called models, and create the first one, owner account. As I said, this will have two properties, one with the ID and one with the name. Then we can also look on the other objects like this. I know them by heart, so I will just define them right away. One is the bound log. The bound log will as well contain an ID, and in this case it is called title. Another one will be contact. In our case, we don't need an ID of a contact. We will only need the identifier. And the last one is grant. That's what we are going to create. And every grant will be defined by bound log ID. In our case, contact right away. And the properties from when is it valid and till when it is valid. Okay, now when we have this done, we can go back to the Tapkey API and create a first method which will return the owner accounts, get all owner accounts. Okay, so we've seen what's the path for this API. So let's use the client get string async right away with /API /version1 and /owners. And to return, we will actually deserialize this response, set this is not very safe. We just count then that all the data are returned correctly. Okay, let's go back to program CS, where we create the Tapkey API client with the access token that we have just received. And we can return all of the owner accounts. We will await this call, get all owner accounts. Okay, now when we have all of the owner accounts, we want the user to select which one he wants to use to create the grant for, or create the grant in. So we will ask the user, please select an owner from the list below by typing its number. So we will list them all with the numbers, the for loop. Okay. And first we'll return an index with +1, so it's human readable. Then owner accounts on that index and return its name. Now we need to wait for the input of the user. So we'll just reline. Then we will parse the index out of it. So let's int parse. Okay. And in the end, we will store the owner account ID, which will be the owner accounts on that index dot ID. And I made some typo. Okay, now when we have the owner account ID, we want to list all of the bound logs of this owner account. So let's go back to Tapkey API and define the Tapkey, define the task that will return the list of the bound logs. Get all bound logs for a certain owner account ID. So in this case, bound logs JSON response will again make a get call on API version 1 owners with owner account ID / bound logs. And we can use the same way to parse the bound log. Okay, let's go get back to program CS and basically do the same thing, but with the bound logs. So we will get the bound logs with get all bound logs. Please select a bound log from the list below by typing its number. Let's write the title, and then the same ways to parse the index. So bound log index string, bound log index, bound log ID. Okay. Get all bound logs. We forgot to pass the actual owner account ID here. Good. So now the user will select an owner account. After that, he'll select a bound log for which he wants to create the grant. And the last thing is he needs to create a contact, or he needs to define what user should get the grant. So let's ask him, make an empty line and ask the user to define an email. Let's define an email of the contact to assign grant to. Now let's expect the contact email. Okay, and now we want to create a new grant. So let's do so. New grant with the bound log ID that we already have. The contact, this is actually a shortcut. So you can either create a contact alone and get an ID and then use, when creating grant, the contact ID to create a grant for, or you can create a contact like this. This is basically a shortcut, so I'll just define the identifier with the contact email, valid from date time now, so it will be valid immediately, and valid before will be daytime now at days 1. So we'll make it valid for 1 day. Okay, now what we need to do is actually send this grant. So let's go back to Tapkey API and create the last call, which will be create grant. Again, we'll expect an owner account ID and actual grant object. And there's typos again. Okay. So let's store the response and call client.put as JSON async, something we need to import. Okay. Grant, and let's call /API /v1 owners. Now again the owner account ID. Grants, and send the grant that we have just created. We can return the bool, basically just the value if the response was successful. Okay, and we can go back to program CS, wait, Tapkey API client, create grant, owner account ID, grant, and in the end write a message based on the result, of course. Either grant for a bound log ID and contact email has been created, or if the result was false, we can just return a generic error. There was an error creating the grant. Now the code seems to be okay, so what we need to do is to pass the information about the client ID and client secret. Let's do it through the debug mode. So let's define a client ID as client secret. Okay, we see the launch settings JSON. Now all we need is a client credentials client, so we can get the information about the client ID and client secret. So let's open portal.tapkey.io. First, I will show you the owner account I have prepared. So continue with email. And here is my owner account with 3 logs. We see there are no smartphone users besides me. And let's say we create a grant for main door that has no grant so far. So let's go to integrate the portal, login. And create a new OAuth client. Demo client credentials. Copy client credentials. As I said, the client credentials client acts on its own behalf, and therefore it acts like its own entity and needs to be assigned a co-admin rights to the login system. So with this click, I'll make him a co-admin of this login system. What do we need is core entities, read and write, because we will need to create a contact, we will need to create a grant, and we will need to read the owners. So here we see all the scopes that we need. Let's save the client credentials and copy the values of client ID and client secret. Of course, this is not the way to store the client secret. You should find a proper way to store this securely, but for demo purposes, to simplify it, this is the way I'm gonna present it. Okay, now when we have this, we can close. And what we need to do is we forgot to define the scopes that we're gonna ask from the user. So one will be read owner accounts, then there will be read core entities, write core entities, and write grants. Okay. So this actually should be it. So let's start our project and have a look if it works. It opened a different screen. So please select an owner from the list below by typing its number. So here we see we have one owner account to select from, my logs. So let's select it. Oops, and we have an issue here. I see. So in the view, I moved the index by 1, but I forgot to subtract it here. The same will happen for bound logs. Okay, let's start again. My logs. Please select the bound log from the list below by typing its number. We see it read the bound logs correctly, and we said we want to assign grant for my main door. Define an email, so let's do it Jochen plus webinar@tapkey.com. And grant for bound log and contact has been created. Let's have a look on mytapkey.com. Let's open main door, and we see that there is a grant from now on, when it was recorded, till tomorrow the same time. Jochen was also created as a smartphone user. Here we see we have a smartphone user, which is actually the client credentials client, which is made and co-admin of my owner account. Amazing! That was it. Application is running and the grants are created. Of course, this is not the best example of application with proper structure or properly solved error handling, but I wanted to keep the example simple enough for you to be able to follow easily. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's preferred that you use a framework to handle OAuth 2 instead of implementing it yourself, as such library will have most likely all the edge cases handled properly. Code is shared on GitHub together with all our other sample applications, and you can find the link in the description of this video. As this is not live event, if there are any questions regarding the implementation, you are welcome to ask them on Stack Overflow with the tag Tapkey, and we, or maybe someone else, will answer them as soon as possible. This way we can keep the community help each other and also keep the answers available for any future integrators. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention, wish you a happy integrating, and see you in the next episode. Bye bye.